Hi. So Mercury just went retrograde, and Jupiter did so too, just now in Cancer. And on top of that, Uranus also just went back into Taurus for Uranus' very last time, very last months in the sign of Taurus. Even just one of these things by themselves would be enough to really make us feel like, whoa, something is shifting. There is a shift in time or in speed or in how we approach things in the last days or weeks or month, that suddenly, like a gear shifting in the car, something needs to adjust to a different quality of time, to a different quality of our expression and our engagement with reality. The fact that we have three of these things at the same time, two big retrogrades starting like 2 days, 3 days next to each other, and on top of this, one of the major planets, Uranus, shifting signs, is signaling even more how we're in a moment where it's maybe so much about slowing down and also doing all of these typical retrograde energies or activities. The lessons that retrogrades want to bring is all of these words also with RE, to rethink, reconsider, reweave, to redo how we approach these archetypal functions within our own self and in our own life, and learn to do them in a new way. For today, I really want to focus especially on the Mercury retrograde, because there's so much, and it's so deep and complex and multi-layered and rich and full, this Mercury retrograde. And for this, I also really want to open up the chart and show it on the chart to you. On the one hand, so that you can really see all of the connections yourself. But on the other, I sometimes feel like the chart can be just in the way or like in between, where the showing a chart or like going through the chart can get very technical. I know for some people they love it, the ones of you that really study astrology a bit more. Some people find that a bit overwhelming. But I think in a case like this, where Mercury is ticking off so many things at the same time, it really helps to visualize it and go through it together. So you can see all of the complexity that this Mercury retrograde wants to bring to us, and at least have that mental, perceptual understanding a bit more of it. That does not save us from having to experience these things, of course. Just because we know what we need to work on, or what we maybe need to release, or what kind of reconsidering and repatterning of our nervous system or old storylines that this Mercury retrograde might bring, just because we understand that doesn't mean we're safe from having to live through that and also experientially feel and embody that process. So it's not a safety net. It gives a bit more clarity, but not necessarily more certainty. It's just helping us to tune into the energies in a more conscious way and align with them instead of resisting the lessons that show up. One big thing with Mercury retrograde is very often a sense of frustration, because of how when Mercury goes direct, we have a feeling of time is moving forward. My plans, my visions, my whatever projects that I'm setting into motion, they will play out in a certain time frame in linear time. Once Mercury goes retrograde, the energy is turned within. And that's why we have all of these usual Mercury is connecting, all of these delays or hiccups or funky little twists and meanderings that Mercury can then bring us on, with emails not, never arriving where they're meant to be arrived. Meant to be received, trains being delayed, technical things malfunctioning. All of these are lessons in us learning to become more flexible and adaptable and open and curious to meet reality on new terms, instead of the maybe rigid or unconscious mental patterns that over the last weeks or months we maybe established, or that are maybe even much older than that. Mercury goes retrograde, of course, roughly every 3.5-4 months, 3 to 4 times a year. And curiously also, the time that Mercury is retrograde in general pretty much equals the time that we humans spend sleeping in a lifetime. So that's very interesting, because this is what the Mercury retrogrades also are meant to be doing, to reset our mind and nervous system, to integrate all of the experiences of the previous 3 months, but then come out with a greater clarity instead of the constant outward engagement with reality, to bring energy back in, to reflect internally, and then to reconsider and rethink and reweave the kinds of stories we tell ourselves, or how we mentally, perceptually engage with reality, because that's so much of the kind of glasses that we're wearing. And then reality meets us there in its teaching function to show us that what we perceive we will probably also see. And there is so much of this inner interesting dynamic to realize that the biggest part of our work is internal and is not external. We often try to achieve external results so that we can shift internal patterns of thinking or believing. But when we shift the internal patterns of how we think, it's more Mercury, or how we believe, or what we believe about ourselves and the world, it's more Jupiter. Once we shift them internally, outer reality will change usually much more. But we're often going about outside in instead of inside out, waiting and fighting and struggling against reality, against life, against ourselves, in order to prove or create a proof that the new kind of belief I want to have is real, or that I can let go of this or that old story that I'm telling myself semi-consciously. But usually it's the other way around, that it's much quicker if we're able to change the internal pattern, and that then external reality will mirror back a new face to us, right? You can stand between 10 people and there's 10 different realities they'll all perceive, right? No person sees the same thing in the same way, and that's like so much of this inner energetic auric field that we are carrying around with us. Anyhow, before I open up the chart, of course, always helps me so much and is so appreciated if you feel like liking this video, leaving comments, or subscribing to my channel. I really appreciate that so much. And then, as always, I'm available for one-on-one sessions where we really deepen and go into your own personal astrology, into your own personal birth chart. Not just seeing the blueprint and the pattern of your own psyche, of your life, of your longings and gifts and dreams and abilities, and where you might feel very, very blocked or running into karmic obstructions, but also these deeper timing techniques where Mercury retrograde and Jupiter retrograde are happening in your own life right now, and what that says much more personally and specifically to you and to your own life pattern and your own evolution and individuation, but also deeper timing patterns that are completely subjective and personal to your own process. Having said that, let's open up the chart. And we see here, right next to Mercury here in Sagittarius, early Sagittarius, there's this little RX, which means Mercury is already retrograde. It went retrograde, if I'm not fully mistaken, here from Sunday to Monday. So like 2 days ago. And now you see right next to Jupiter here, you also see a little S, a red S, which means that Jupiter is stationing and is about to go retrograde. If I move a day forward, it also turns into this RX for retrograde. A few things just about Mercury in general still, right? I already explored a bit Mercury as that function of communication and connecting things, right? This is also why Mercury rules trade and commerce, rules technology, rules travel. It's all of these things where we connect, where we cross borders and boundaries. Mercury is neither fully this nor that. It's neither fully yin nor yang. It's not a day planet, it's not a night planet. He is very much at home in this twilight. And he is so much about the inner connection also to something higher and beyond, right? Both to the underworld, our subconscious, or the collective subconscious, as much as to the higher divine Mount Olympus. So in that function in our nervous system, right, Mercury also rules in yogic philosophy, the Sushumna, so the central channel of the spine. where the undulating wave patterns of Ha and Ta, the sun and the moon, or yin and yang, which is where Hatha yoga is coming from, are fully meeting, and we can connect to the sun or our higher self, and in that way also come to moments of enlightenment, right? The light of the sun. That is what Mercury also connects us to. Mercury retrogrades are always moments when Mercury is exactly in between the earth and the sun. So kind of crossing that inner temple, that inner connection that we have with earth and matter and our home here, and the heart of the sun. Mercury retrogrades move through that central space that we have between the earth and the sun. For the rest of the cycle, Mercury is on the left or on the right or on the far side of the sun. But this inner space, just thinking metaphorically or mythopoetically, is also a bit like that holy place that where we can really meet something higher, something beyond, something transcendental, that the sun as the royal divine energy kind of transmits to us. So that's an interesting thing to consider also for when Mercury is actually meeting the sun, when there is this inferior conjunction, the midpoint of Mercury retrograde, when Mercury meets the sun, which in this time will be pretty much exactly together with the Scorpio New Moon, which deepens the symbology of the Scorpio New Moon in 8 days or whatever, even more. The other thing, that Mercury as the messenger of the gods, the psychopomp, who was also able to guide the souls through the underworld or to the Hades, is that he is exactly this function that I just said about like connecting and helping different parts of ourselves come into reference with each other, and understanding and perspectives, new perspectives with each other. There's also Mercury's rulership of Gemini, of learning to see things from both sides or another side and up and down, and learning to see that everything is an infinite gradient of gray between white and black, and that there's never not getting fixed on one or the other. And that is what Mercury retrogrades also do. They are about, on the one hand, the Virgo kind of side of Mercury, the cleansing, the purifying, the releasing, the what is actually useful for me, what kind of information or insights or connections are useful for my greater vision and what are not. Where have I cluttered myself too much and now need to mentally purify, need to do a digital detox, need to do a fast, need to do whatever to also mentally release the nervous system. But also the Gemini side of Mercury, where and how must I learn to see things from a different angle and with a different twist so that I get mentally more flexible and open. And the frustrations we meet with the technical hiccups, with the delayed train, with the phone dropped into the water, whatever it might be, they often have a funky and funny and kind of mischievous way of coming around. Mercury is the god of trickstery. And of course, it's not just something external, it's a part of our own psyche, of our own greater self with a capital S, that wants us to see things through a different angle, and often has this mischievous way where we at first might get very frustrated or get annoyed or get confused and have to go on little funky twists and turns and spirals and spins, very different to what we initially thought how we would go about going from A to B. Suddenly Mercury brings us through C and X and Y before he brings us to B. But this mischievous trickery always has like a little twinkling in the eye with it, because very often you'll find that at the end of the Mercury retrogrades, there is usually reveals and there is connections that suddenly click and make sense in a new way, where if things would have played out how you normally linearly want to go from A to B, to stick with that example, so many other things, so many other insights or communications or connections or perspectives, or having met that person on the street, you all know the funky little synchronicities that like, oh, you forgot your key and so you go back to your flat or your house for just a minute longer, but then because of that minute longer, you bump into somebody like on the street, a person you maybe haven't seen in ages, which if you would have not forgotten your key, you would have just passed them by, right? These interesting there is a lot of magic in these kinds of synchronicities and how they come about if you really think about it. the tiniest little minutiae of detail changing would have not led to this connection, to this synchronicity, to you bumping into this person, for example, on the street. So that's a few things just on Mercury retrograde in general. Now, why this Mercury retrograde is so full, so complex, so multi-layered, so rich, so deep, is exactly because there's so much shifting of all the outer planets, apart from Pluto, but Jupiter, Saturn and Neptune and Uranus. So 4 of these major, bigger outer planets, Mercury is ticking off in this retrograde. Right now it is together with Mars, which I'll also say a word about, but I quickly just want to point out all the things that Mercury will tick off and connect in these bigger cycles that we're in. So on the one hand, like I just said, Jupiter is also just going retrograde, stationing, and then going retrograde here in Cancer. Uranus here is just back into Taurus, and Mercury will oppose it in a couple of days. And Saturn and Neptune here at the end of Pisces are, interestingly, just before Mercury goes direct, by the end of November. 1 or 2 days before, Saturn also goes direct. And then later on the 10th or 11th of December, once Mercury reaches the degree where it meets the Sun for the new moon, so the integration, the completion, the unraveling of the puzzle, and where suddenly that mischievous twink of the puzzle piece falls into place, and you really suddenly realize, like, oh wow, okay, now this is why it had to happen that way. Exactly on that day is also when Neptune will go direct. So there's shifting of all of these outer planets, and Mercury is also connecting every single one of them. It's not just happening during its retrograde, but it's also connecting to every single one of them. Mercury will make an aspect to all of them. But going from one to the other, first of all, Mercury is retrograde in Sagittarius. So it's so much about where and how must I embrace a new mental perspective on what kind of Sagittarius stories I'm telling, meaning I'm seeking, vision I'm having. Sagittarius is so much about the stories and the meaning that we give for life and reality, which then lead to the stories that we tell, which leads to also the unconscious belief systems. And that is right what I said earlier, the inner way that we mentally perceive from our mind and our nervous system. That's Mercury, right? If I've got some trauma stuck in me for God knows how long, 2 years or 25 years, and it maybe gets triggered off by a trigger XYZ, this kind of color, this animal, a person with this kind of sounding voice or smell or something, my nervous system will react and will maybe contract or will maybe go into fight or flight mode, right? This is like that Mercury part also is definitely there, the nervous system. The other thing is that Jupiter function of our unconscious beliefs. What do we believe about ourselves is often how we feel reality is mirrored back to us. And this Mercury retrograde in Sagittarius is so much about releasing these kinds of unconscious beliefs and the associated stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and the kind of meaning that we find in life, the kind of quest for meaning that we are longing for, to be also connected to something greater. It's very interesting to consider with this, of course, that Jupiter is the natural ruler of Sagittarius, where Mercury just went retrograde, and Jupiter is also the natural ruler of Pisces, where we have this huge crisis, this huge collective crisis of meaning, of purpose, of clarity, of all the Pisces sides as well, of fogginess, loss of direction, exhaustion, tiredness, fatigue, of feeling we all can feel this huge new wave which is coming to hit our shores in a couple of months by February, once these two are meeting in Aries and the huge new cycle is beginning. But right now we're still in the huge release of a gigantic old cycle. It's not just the last 30 years of Saturn through the zodiac, and it's also not just the last 165 years of Neptune through the zodiac, but it's also the conjunction of both of them together. Really, there's no words to emphasize how big the meeting of Saturn and Neptune is on 0 degrees of Aries in February, and how big also... Getting a power cut in that second. Okay, I still got one light going. I guess we'll have to do it with that. That's funny. Yeah, there's no way to tell how big it is. It is exactly like that. It's a huge cutting of the power to then reboot the system. A huge new cosmic collective starting of a new timeline. But with that associated is so much Neptune, where and how we feel a loss of meaning, of a transcendental feeling, where there is gloominess and anxiety and overwhelm, all of these Pisces archetypes, where we maybe try to go into escapism or numb ourselves instead of really meeting reality with love, trust, surrender, and an inner grace to flow with things. So we have this big crisis of meaning definitely written in the sky, and now we have a Mercury retrograde that begins in Sagittarius, which is also on that personal quest of meaning. Where and how do we strive for meaning on a personal way? And Jupiter going retrograde, ruling both of these signs. Both, there's the power again, both Sagittarius and Pisces. As Mercury moves backwards, it'll go back into Scorpio, and in that way will then also reactivate the grand water trine that we have with these planets, with Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn, Neptune in Pisces. But first of all, we've got Mercury together with Mars. There is that Sagittarius impulse for, and where and how we maybe also want to break out of all the deep, dark, heavy Scorpio energy that we've been dealing with now for weeks and weeks, longer than Scorpio season, because Mercury and Mars had their conjunction for the Libra New Moon at the very end of Libra also. Sagittarius as an answer to Scorpio is so much about, I want to break free, I want to get out, I need to move, I need to expand, I want to see greater vision, I'm tired of being stuck in the emotional humdrum of my old inner vulnerable stories, so rather let's go out and explore, let's just make fun of it, let's joke about it, let's be easy. Mars and Sagittarius can be a bit reckless with the directness of and bluntness of the truth that we're thinking that we know and how we express that. Mars just gives energy to whatever it touches. Energy, fire, heat, aggression, anger. Mercury together with Mars gives a lot of fire and energy to these deeper questions, to also the personal question, what is meaningful to me? How do I create meaning in the world? What do I want to believe in? And what kind of old stories do I maybe can burn away or cut away, Mars? The danger here is, of course, for the next 2 days or so, that Mercury-Mars combinations can also make us very short-tempered and having a quick fuse. Mercury is quick and fast, and it's also our tongue. So Mars on Mercury is like a quick tongue, a fiery tongue, a sharp tongue, a cutting words, fiery words, angry words, because of when and how we maybe just try to get away and move away from the inner emotional depth that we've been working through and maybe don't want to be bothered with by anymore, don't want to deal with. But at the same time, Mars definitely does give a lot of oomph to these questions so that we can break through and move out of the heavy water that maybe has been weighing us down. Again, not just for the Scorpio season, but Saturn, Neptune, and Pisces, maybe for years or decades of our lives or generations. Moving forward though through the days, then we have by the 19th of November here, Mercury moves back into Scorpio. And then on the 20th, you see, let me find the exact moment here. Here's the new moon. on the 20th in the early morning here in Europe on 28 degrees and 11 minutes. And right next to it, there's also Mercury. And at the same time, of course, 19th, 20th of November, Mercury will thus also oppose Uranus. So much to be said just about Uranus and Taurus, cryptocurrencies and AI, cottagecore, and the revolution is just making a homestead and having some chickens. For the last 7 years, the most revolutionary thing in many ways was the Taurus simplicity, but also the Uranus and Taurus, the inflation of technology, that maybe Taurus has no tangible reality. There's nothing really backing, there's nothing behind a funky NFT or a lot of the AI bubble and stuff that we're in right now, which I really hope is a bubble that will pop at some point, because it lacks that Taurus embodiment, it lacks the Taurus tangibility for physical things. Taurus needs physical things. We cannot bypass that function there. But that already points us to what Taurus is so much about. It is about stability in our human animal body, with our senses and the simplicity of the here and now, that we're safe, we've got food and a house and clothes on our back, and this simplicity in that, the simplicity of that desire of Taurus is just that. Mercury opposite Uranus usually brings out a lot of buzz. Uranus' energy is very buzzing, but it does so that it helps also to dislodge or release old energetic patterns and unconscious trauma to us that kept us out of being fully in our body. It's the end of Taurus and Uranus and Taurus now for the next couple of months. So it's so much about a reclaiming and a realignment with what are our core values, but also where and how do I feel valuable, regardless of whatever other things I might compare myself to in society, but just the inherent, unconditioned, authentic sense of embodiment in the present moment in our human body, and the simplicity of that, which very much contrasts the complexity of the emotional terrain of Scorpio. Mercury opposite Uranus usually brings out a lot of clarity, a lot of also this Uranus bird's eye perspective, zooming out of things and really grasping them from a new angle, understanding things in a deeper or higher light. On top of this, it's a Scorpio New Moon at the end of Scorpio, and then on top of it, it's of course also connecting the grand water trine again, both to Saturn and Neptune here in Pisces, as well as to Jupiter in late Cancer. So Mercury moving back into Scorpio can feel like a reluctant pull back into the deeper emotional waters before we can hear Sagittarius find that great freedom, find the forward momentum, find the new clarity. Mercury retrograde is not about the true deep clarity. The clarity usually, at the moment Mercury meets the sun, there can be a bit of an illumination. On a deeper level, it's kind of a seeding moment. There is, at least on subconscious level, in the dream time maybe, especially with all of this water energy, in our imagination, our longing, and our dreams, something seeded that only later on in the following weeks and months will really come into conscious mental conception and conscious mental appreciation. And also only after the Mercury retrograde is usually when full true clarity emerges. Now Mercury moving back into Scorpio even brings more of this psychopomp energy, the underworld, the subconscious energy out. And it is about there, hey, we want to find new beliefs and new sense of self-beliefs and new stories we tell ourselves and new kind of meaning, higher, deeper, greater vision of meaning that we want to find. But Mercury moving back into Scorpio tells us, but we first still have to do deeper emotional work on all of these parts of Scorpio where we maybe still carry emotional trauma, which with Scorpio is so often interpersonal. Trust and betrayal, abandonment, backstabbing, not feeling emotionally safe, and in that way having and developing a lot of psychic sensitivity to be able to penetrate other people's auras, other people's fields, other people's hidden emotional motivations, because of where and how one has experienced all of the loss, all of the grief, all of the abandonment, all of the broken trust that Scorpio maybe also knows all the shadow terrain there, but then can hopefully turn that into medicine, into clarity. This Uranus and Taurus feels like such a big key of this puzzle, though, telling us so much more, just like the Taurus moon already did, that with all of the intensity that we're moving through, with all of the world-ending, timeline, tectonic plate shifting, Saturn, Neptune, Pluto in Aquarius kind of stuff, that it's so much about our embodied, grounded, stable presence in our physical body. And that this is our anchor that can always bring us back to the present moment and bring us back to, it's actually not maybe all so wild, and we don't have to get lost in the complex shadow territory of our past or our relationships or our family dynamics or our ancestral lines or whatever, but we can just learn to trust the present moment because we trust our physical body in the here and now. As Mercury then moves further backwards, as the days progress forward, right, this is days here, it also starts to meet Venus, bringing even more of these interpersonal relationship dynamics, but also the dynamics of values and our sense of self-worth and worthiness up a lot. There might be more Scorpio, more shedding, more releasing, but also more deep psychological insights into us and others and the patterns and complexities that we maybe play out together with each other. And as they do so, of course, the entire time, this grand water trine is active to both Saturn and Neptune as well as to Jupiter. That's the last word I kind of want to say is in regards to Jupiter, but Jupiter retrograde on top of this, right? Jupiter is our quest for meaning, a bit like Sagittarius, and how we go about trying to find that sense of optimism and luck and joy and abundance and possibilities. Jupiter going retrograde in Cancer now shows us the quest for longing, the longing to belong, the quest for our longing of safety. And this is something I already talked about, I think in the Taurus full moon video, so much about Jupiter is about expansion, but Jupiter going retrograde now in Cancer is about where and how do I have to expand my emotional body in order to contain more of myself so that actually new possibilities and new opportunities and new potentials for who I can be, who I want to be, how I can be met, how I can feel inside of myself. Jupiter has to create a lot of space in that emotional body of ours, in that inner child space of ours. The retrograde, the energy pulls back, and it shows us the path to meaning. In this moment in time, at least, next year will look very, very different. Once the energy is much more in Sagittarius, come middle of December, it'll also look more different again. But for now, it's so much about the depth of feeling, the depth of water, the depth of going into our emotions. And that the inner look, that the inward look is actually what will help us see reality outwardly much clearer. And that has so much to do with how we learn to connect internally to our feeling nature, to our emotional body within. We can't sidestep that. Again, Mars and Sagittarius, we can't just blast through and say like, oh, but I'm here, I'm going on this path, and I'm done with all of this heavy water. We can try that, but then we just recreate these patterns of abandonment to ourselves. Self-abandonment, self-neglect, self-denial. And that just repeats also storylines, the Taurus, Venus, Uranus kind of story here, where and how I don't feel worthy of love, of care, of attention, of safety. If we do that to ourselves, we keep on unconsciously inflicting exactly the kind of wounds that we usually want to get away with Scorpio energy. Jupiter in Cancer shows us it is about the inner gaze, the inner emotional connection that opens outer horizons. But the inner emotional gaze has to mean creating more space, more spaciousness in our emotional field to hold and contain everything that we feel, including all of our longing, including all of our yearning, including all of the childhood emotions that have not been processed, and also being okay with that. Embodying more of that witness archetype within, that can see like, okay, part of me is feeling that, but I don't need to go into identification with that and then be again like, oh, I'm the poor victim, or I'm the angry one, or whatever kind of story we're telling ourselves there. Remember the stories. But can see like, oh, one part of me feels helpless or like a victim right now. Or one part of me feels immense rage at the injustice of my past. But to not go into identification, but create enough spaciousness so that we can see and hold that and at the same time contain it and be present with ourselves forward. So yeah, can bring up a lot of sensitivity, a lot of vulnerability. Nobody said it was easy. But it's also the ending then of the Grand Water Trine. I'll speak more on it as Venus also hits these points. Super interesting. Wow. End of November. And that's also here. You see 28th of November is here when Saturn gets that little S next to it because Saturn's about to go direct. Mercury still has that RX next to it. And a day later, Saturn is direct and Mercury stations to go direct as well by the 29th, 30th of November. And then, like I said, at the end of it, when Mercury moves over the same degrees where it went retrograde, and when usually the funky, mischievous twists and turns that Mercury brings us on suddenly come to resolution, clarity comes, connections have been made, bills are finally paid or whatever, like things are like settled that were maybe up in the air or stuck in the ether or the ether net somewhere. And as Mercury here by December the 10th hits the degree where it had the conjunction with the sun, that seeding moment of light, of illumination, of clarity, Neptune stations to go direct. Mercury, the messenger of the gods. Mercury, the great communicator. Mercury, the guide of souls. The one who's dancing in the twilight. Connecting all of these big storylines here. And all of these shifting sands and territories and times and timelines. It's such a rich and interesting Mercury retrograde. And just to see on December the 12th is when Mercury goes back into Sagittarius. And to finally wrap it up, by December the 16th, 17th, it reaches the degrees where it went retrograde in the first place. We'll still have the moon quickly pass through Scorpio, briefly reactivating an echo of that Grand Water Trine. But by December 12th, once Mercury leaves Scorpio for Sagittarius, the Grand Water Trine, this massive Grand Water Trine, which by that point we'll have had going on since 6+ weeks, is slowly ebbing away and then really makes space for the new fire of Sagittarius a bit more. Anyhow, that was so much. I hope you were able to follow all of this. It got into a long video as well, turning into darkness, including that little power cut for the big collective Saturn-Neptune shifts. Mercury really feels like a big bridge between everything right now and like a deep preparation for also the new fire energy, right? Mercury mirrors exactly what Saturn and Neptune have done. They went into Aries, but then went back into Pisces. And Mercury now began its retrograde in Sagittarius and fire, but it goes back into water, into Scorpio, because it shows us there's still a deeper resolution and healing and cleaning that needs to happen on these watery, emotional, and also spiritual level of ours. Water is so much also, fire is spirit itself, but water is how we, through devotion and emotion and longing, connect to that and how we yearn to merge with something greater and something beyond. It's not that fiery vision, but it's the mediumistic channeling of the potential of that vision, right? So it's interesting to see that Mercury also mirrors this Saturn-Neptune journey. And yes, what I said is this Mercury retrograde really feels like a huge preparation for whatever is to come in the new year once Saturn and Neptune are slowly moving out of Pisces and into Sagittarius, into Aries. And that's exactly, of course, what Mercury also does, that it ticks them off. It's like, oh, that retrograde ends. Now Saturn goes direct. Oh, the retrograde really ends. The degrees are culminating again. They're hitting the same spot, and then Neptune goes direct. So much forward momentum from that moment on, middle of December, which is in another month. So we still have a moment to reconsider a lot of stories and how we tell them to ourselves. So thank you so much for listening. I hope this gave something to you, and I'll see you next time.